And we are live. Mr. Praise of Folly, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you, wondering, Panda?
I'm doing pretty good. Hey, I appreciate you interrupting your sabbatical and jumping on here and going ahead and discussing some different things.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I am absolutely a broken record. If anybody is familiar with me, they know that one of my frustrations, one of my concerns, one of my passions is agriculture, is young men, how they're able to get involved and do things. And if we can combine those two, that's awesome. How do we get young men into agriculture? From my perspective, being on the ground doing different things, I think there's a lot of pitfalls, there's a lot of hurdles, there's a lot of issues getting young people into agriculture. So, Mr. Praise of Folly here, Mr. Todd, he goes on and he will talk about socialism. He will dig into different governmental issues and forms and occupations within hierarchies. And I thought he would be a perfect guest to just say, hey, maybe here's some solutions. And I'm hoping we get super creative tonight. I don't really care within the confines of this stream and within the confines of the idea of agriculture how left wing, how right wing we are. I just want to get creative and say, what are some solutions? So,
Yeah,
Todd, if you want to just jump in and go for it.
yeah, okay. So I think firstly it would be good to lay down some like historical uh, rails for the fence about the different attempts at socialist agriculture, quote unquote. So obviously, we think of the Soviet Union, we think of communist China, we think of massive famines. First thing we need to point out is the mid 20th century Germans didn't have crop failures during peacetime. That now during the war is different, but not during peacetime. So that needs to be kept in mind. Whatever. Now, if we use Mises' definition of socialism, which many on the right do anyhow, he would consider the entire German project socialist from 1871 down till Adolf Hitler. In which case, Germany never had crop failures. So apparently, Germany has a great agricultural socialist track record. If you take Mises and the American free trade fanatics as your baseline, and many do. So there's that. Second of all, we have the kibbutz, the Israeli communes from the early 20th century down to the present day. Though around the 80s, they stopped being communal. You also didn't have shortages, though they were more anarchist and also closely knit ethnically, as well as organized around a socialist belief system which functioned as a religion. So those are two examples of socialist agriculture that works. Social agriculture that doesn't work, like in the Soviet era, part of the problem was early on they over-indexed into machine tools like tractors and such without proper. Because see, if you look at the energy costs and the cost of using all these things, if they're not used well, then they're you need to have infrastructure to support the tractors and everything. So Stalin's drive towards mechanization created a overproduction of these things without the infrastructure necessary to keep it going. So that was partly why you had agricultural failures in the 30s. That's something that Sutton gets into in his first volume on the technical transfers. But then also, there's a sense in which both the kibbutz and the Germans were more, well, they had a more clearly delineated identity based around ethnicity and almost a religious belief system, whether it be socialism in the case of the kibbutz or national socialism in the case of the Germans. And the Soviets just didn't have that, and the Chinese didn't really have that either. And in the case of China and the East Asians, they also just didn't have a highly educated managerial class, which could have guided or led agricultural development. Because I think what a lot of people need to understand is agricultural development begins with state planning in the Middle East and Egypt and China. That's where it starts. And so it's not so much that socialism can't do this or state planning can't do this. It's how large scale agriculture started. The problem is what other factors are involved in large scale agricultural production that the Chinese communists and the Russian communists lacked. So starting with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's going on here, or at least from my perspective, we have two major within this stream. We have two major streams that we can go down, and the first one is some form of state-led hierarchy, state-led managerial solution. and then the other one is more of a hands-off community-based solution. Which route do we want to go down first?
Well, let's start with the state one because that's where large agriculture begins in Babylon
Okay.
and Egypt with state management of water resources, right? The Nile and Euphrates rivers through carefully maintained irrigation networks. Now, why is that the case? Well, because you need to have upfront capital to do this. And in the Bronze Age, the only way to get that kind of upfront capital was through taxation. Now, we do see in Europe small scale farming in Greece and in Rome and Italy, the Germanic tribes, the Celtic tribes, but that radiates out from the Middle East. And by that point, think of it this way: when the United States economy develops a new drug, other countries pick up on that drug, but they didn't have to pay the cost of upfront development. The United States did, but it still spreads out from there. So Greece and Italy and the Celtic and Germanic tribes had small scale farms, and eventually Rome had large scale farming, but they didn't pay the upfront cost for the perfection of the tools of large scale agriculture. That was the kingdoms and empires of Egypt and Babylon.
Yeah. So here's something for you, and tell me where this starts falling apart. Right now, let's say that it takes we'll go sort of middle of the road and say $8,000 per acre of decent agricultural land, whether that's row cropping, whether that's keeping livestock. There's some differences in there that we're going to ignore. So 8,000 to do it at a scale that is sustainable and where you're producing everything. We're going to say this is a closed loop system. You're doing your grain, you're doing your hay, you're doing everything. It's different on row crops because it will be um, you're not going to be feeding animals. It's not going to be quite as diversified. To do all this, we're going to say 100 acres already before we even get into any sort of machinery costs, any sort of infrastructure. Just purely on buying the acreage. At that point, we're at over $750,000. The how is a I have my own solutions, but I want to hear your answer to this. How is a 24-year-old who did well in college supposed to jump into that and begin that as a career path?
I mean, going into debt, I suppose, is one way, but that's not the ideal way.
Right.
The other thing is what would have to happen, I think, is something like large scale crowdfunding based on sort of agricultural initiatives. Think of like farmers unions or farmers co-ops, and you'd have to have some sort of large scale, cost sharing capital accumulation project like that, which we don't currently have.
No, we don't. And this one, so on this particular stream, all of a sudden we have the two streams of what is the hierarchy, how is it established, and then who manages it and is in control of it. Like you said, crowdfunding would be one way to do it. One of my solutions is that if I'm king for a day, all of a sudden the government the government is in control of all of that. However, there's a funnel for those fellas that are proving themselves at school within the agricultural arena that enables them to get on the land and it's not even a lease, but it's kind of a land grant. And what that land grant does says that if you're meeting minimum returns and the government is managing what's coming out of there, it's also handling infrastructure costs and supplying machinery and equipment because the government is ultimately dictating what crops and what livestock you're participating in. That seems like a viable way to engage in this. Now that frustrates the market. I realize that's not a free market idea. And so there's issues there with supply and demand, but that would be one way wherein we can get young guys on there without crushing them in debt. Because I don't know, one, I don't think any bank will lend that particular amount, and then two, dude, no 25-year-old should be struggling under over $500,000 in debt when the return, especially, is maybe 50,000 a year net.
Well, yeah, I mean that so we can break down your question into two levels, right? One is under our current financial situation, but then also in a more abstract sense, what would just work, right? So in some sort of like theoretical vacuum, no, not assuming our current labor market or economy,
Right.
just what are the facts on the ground that need to be the case in order to get this done. And the other thing is, you pose this thought experiment as an individual, but the problem is agriculture is a collective activity. It's communal, it's
Go
collective.
on.
Yeah, and so ultimately you can't really have individual agriculture, right? You have to have. So let's think about it this way, right? The Mormons, right? They go out west under Brigham Young. They settle pretty crummy land for agriculture in Utah,
Yeah.
but they, as a community, centered around a charismatic leader and a belief system, work together to overcome those odds. And the same thing happens with the kibbutz in the Israeli state in Palestine today. And so what we see is that, and this is subpar agricultural territory too, Utah and Levant is not where you want to go to do that. So this demonstrates the efficacy of a group action with regards to agriculture, even in subpar conditions. And lacking that, one of the main problems we're going to hit is capitalization, as you pointed out.
Yeah. So then, what? I guess let's go from an even broader standpoint. Who should have authority over it? Should it be a communal solution or should it be a government solution?
Well, there's a few things to go into this. The first one is much of the agricultural land out west, in the southern area, which we today call the Sun Belt, which stretches from California to Florida. Without the development of government infrastructure such as aqueducts and dams, that would not be arable at all. California, Texas, you couldn't grow anything there. It would just be, Indian territory like it was during the colonial period. And so, in some sense, now Utah was different. The Mormons didn't have they left the United States. It was still part of Mexico at that point, and they developed it on their own. But this depends on where agriculture takes place. If the agriculture takes place in the Midwest around the Great Lakes or the Great Plains, that's a little different. But if the government is literally the organization that built the infrastructure that allows you to farm in, say, California or Texas, it has a large say in how that's going to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then it becomes a question that there is always the question of, is it worth supporting not just a false economy, but false is too strong a word, a not just supporting a created economy, but also a created form of agriculture, like you mentioned, with the aqueducts, damming rivers, things of that nature. So if nature is not naturally supporting it, should we be engaged in it? And at every point, there are those ethical questions, and the government, the controlling body, is going to have to figure those out. And so if we keep climbing this ladder, what is there a particular solution? I know we've looked at NatSoc a little bit, and you've been mentioning the kibbutz. Do you think there is a particular solution, almost an on ramp, that we as a dare I say post capitalist society here in the U.S. is there an on ramp that we should be considering right now that will transition us into a particular form of agriculture before any sort of collapse occurs?
Well, yeah. Okay. So you brought up a good point about the should, right? If it takes this kind of government intervention, like in the Sun Belt, or large scale technological intervention to actually make areas arable that were previously unarable, is that really the right thing to do? And then also, so yeah, this is sort of where I'm sort of leaning more towards socialism in this regard, or another older idea called technocracy, which comes from the 1930s, which has a bad connotation because it sounds like, oh, you want to have a bunch of eggheads run everything. But the point is this: if we look at an economy as a object, as a sort of space. There's inputs and there's outputs. One input that has to be there, it just form it's so in an economy we have labor which produces goods. We have labor that extracts goods out of the ground. We have money that facilitates the exchange of goods. But what do you have to have before all that? Well, you have to have energy, because if you have an energy sink, there's no economic activity. It just doesn't happen. And so technically, energy is more fundamental than either capitalism or socialism, as like, okay, how are we going to allocate the resources or produce the resources? There's a more fundamental question. Where does the energy for these resources come from? And so if we look at these systems, amongst like environmentalists, there's this idea called bioregionalism, where each region has like its natural ecosystem. So this Cascadia is famous. That's Pacific Northwest and parts of Canada. The Great Lakes Midwest area would be considered Laurentia and other things. And they're like, well, within each of those ecosystems, bioregions, there's proper ways of doing things. And then there's, that they're with the grain of that particular bioregion. Now, obviously, developing all this agriculture in California and Texas is definitely going against the grain, the bioregion of the Southwest, which is a desert. It's not wasn't set up to be that used that way, right? So then the question is, okay, if you want to go against the grain, you're going to have to constantly input energy. Now that would be the aqueducts. Now it would also be electricity into that Sunbelt territory in the West. And that's just not sustainable. That's just not sustainable. You can't keep doing that, because the yield you're going to get from those developed areas in that area are ultimately being propped up by some external source. And eventually, if you can't cover that, it's going to fail. We're already seeing also tensions with the water usage, because the aquifers are being depleted faster than they can be filled up by, natural processes such as rainwater. We're beginning to see some serious, limits here that people didn't really think about, either because they thought, well, I'll be dead by the time that happens, or they just didn't think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that, to put my cards on the table, I'm very, very leery of going in and trying to raise grass, trying to raise pasture in a desert area. It doesn't make sense. And so yes, we are capable of bringing in fresh water. We are capable of squeezing blood from a rock, but is it worth, as you mentioned, is it worth the energy? So when we start talking about this, and we start talking about the government applying infrastructure, as we just talked about within the past 30 seconds, we have particular ideas and particular ways we think things should be going. How do we make sure that the farmer, the person who is involved in the direct application of agricultural ideas, that their voice is being heard? Well, that's a really gay statement, but that their voice is being heard, and that the management of the government, who has an entire country's worth of people to allocate and understand and care for, how do we make sure that those two are interacting properly?
Well, the other problem too now with agriculture is agricultural combines, and what ultimately, and this did the cattle industry in too, is large corporations could just edge everybody out. One, they could just sell for cheaper, so the local farmers are just gone because they can sell for cheaper. Uh, they can have the government come in and create a regulatory environment that's to their advantage. That's why in the past, populist movements, like in the Great Plains, were typically associated with farmers and ranchers, and were often associated with the Democratic Party and the labor movement, because both of them, now one was industrial, right? One was working at factories, and then one was working on the farms. But they both understood that there was a collective bargaining issue here, where large corporations could talk to government officials, pay government officials, and then just frankly, undersell them until they went out. And after let's say the 70s, a lot of that infrastructure was taken away, and there's really no present way in which they're able to make money like that.
Yeah, well, and that is for all their obnoxiousness. When John Mellencamp, at the time, John Cougar is releasing, what was his album with Blood on the Scarecrow? Uh, oh, I think it was just Scarecrow was the album, but he's got that Bruce Springsteen, and so there were these issues being recognized that labor is not producing the fruits that it has been, and then that the little guy is being crowded out. And so that ultimately gets into a question too of, is the idea of a family farm, and it's is that a bad idea? Is that a bad idea for efficiency? Is that a bad idea for a nation state? Is that a bad idea for a country or a group of nation states? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it would be a bad choice if you tried to do it in the wrong part of the country that couldn't naturally do it, right? But the backbone of the American Republic was the small independent farmer until he was more or less completely replaced in the 20th century. And so I think that is a bad thing. I don't think that should have happened. Um, but that is what happened. Now the other thing is with regards to I want to get back to energy here too, because when we talk about economic activity, one of the things that the libertarians and the capitalists like to say is we're efficient. It's more efficient. No, it's not more efficient to turn a desert into Vegas or Orange County if it takes all that extra energy you pulled out of the rest of the country to put it in there. That's not efficiency. That's going against the grain. You're going to eventually run an energy sink. And so now what do? Well, we're not there yet, but when you get there, it's going to be a real kick in the head. So the point is, in Asian Chinese philosophy, the idea of feng shui, right? The idea that you have to follow energy flows. So going with the grain, going with the energy flows, you could, in theory, design a distribution system that has, for lack of a better word, good feng shui. In which case, it would be the most efficient. So let me give you an example. The most efficient way to ship any good over land is rail. Well, that's just a fact. We all know this, but due to political decisions after World War II, that was the rail system was not maintained and it was given over to trucks for large scale, long distance distribution. But that's just not as efficient because it just takes more energy in and more energy out, right? But the thing is, though, it makes certain people a lot of money. So the rail system was done in, right, because of that. So once you understand how energy flows in a region, you could, in theory, then build a distribution system that works along the grain and is maximally efficient in that it doesn't generate conditions that approach an energy sink.
Right. And so when you start bringing the energy idea in abstractly, when you have something like the government in Rhodesia, or I think at the time it was Zimbabwe, regardless, but that South Africa, and they start taking away from the farmers that are already there and are participating in agriculture. What they're actually doing is increasing their energy costs between their distribution, and that was the same thing that we saw with the Holodomor with different Soviet applications. Is that they're expending more energy and getting less in return? Is that a fair?
Well, yeah, and so, but I think industrial agriculture as a whole is going to hit this wall. I mean, clumsy authoritarian regimes are going to hit that wall sooner than more sophisticated regimes, but I think you'd still see that on a long enough time scale. And we also, if you want to go a little woo woo, right? We have ley lines. People want to build cities and along these lines in order to access the energy that's there. So I think we need to look at building an economy in a sort of like, in the same sense that many people on the right talk about meta political or pre political, we need to talk about meta economics, pre economics, and that is energy. That's so before you talk about production, before you talk about distribution, before you talk about the workers, you have to talk about energy. That comes first. And then the question is, then it raises questions about industrial civilization. And this is where I think the environmentalists and the collapsitarians are at least pointing in the right direction, even if they haven't formulated a actual solution yet. It's like, well, what is going to be sustainable, right? In when the energy finally doesn't work out anymore. And Nobody's really figured that out yet. But nonetheless, I think we need to move the discourse to what we might call meta economic discussion, with energy
Oh,
as the foundation.
okay, so I think I hear what you're saying, and correct me where I'm wrong. But I've had this idea. I've posted about it before on X that it makes sense to me that in the future, let's just throw out an arbitrary number and say 200 years from now, our future is going to look much more like certain Miyazaki movies or different things that you saw in the 90s, where there is sort of this combination of very concentrated, very particular machines and portions of technology. And other than that, it is a lot of very labor intensive agriculture and thing ways of living that are actually sustainable apart from our current use of energy. Is that sort of where you're headed?
Well, that it could look like that, right? It
Okay.
could, but I think one interesting corollary or follow up from moving this to the meta economic discussion of energy is what is the most efficient way for a human being to produce the calories necessary for his own existence, and I think it's pretty clearly raising animals because one, you can eat them, but also you can eat what they make. So sheep, and sorry, you can make wool clothing from sheep,
Yes.
but you can either drink the milk directly from cows and goats, or you can turn it into cheese or butter or something else. Chickens make eggs, right? So you have animals that you eat directly, like say pigs, because that's what they're all you do is eat them,
Yes.
or but some animals you can then have to produce something you can eat, or in the case
Well,
of
let me.
Shakespeare.
Yeah, I was going to say I'll jump immediately into this. Sheep are a wonder animal in some ways. You start with the lamb. By that first year, you're doing a shearing. You're getting a little bit of wool off of it. You're also, we're going to assume that it's a ewe. You're taking that ewe and you're breeding her. She is raising more sheep and giving you milk, and you're still getting that shearing, and you continue this process down on the road for about 8 years. You've got this cycle going with her, and then what do we do at the very end? Does she fall over, and does the ground absorb her? No. At the very end, you butcher her, you get that last cutting of wool from her, and at this point you also have 8 years in. Let's say that she's given you 12 lambs in the midst of that have survived. And so it is this exponential, like you were just talking about, it's this exponential energy creation that's going on here that you don't see in um, potatoes, that you don't see. And I don't want to take a dump on vegetables. I think vegetables are actually really good, and they have their own forms of energy in which they're capturing nitrogen and they're helping the soil. But vegetables and livestock are a very different issue from let's call them niche designer crops, and then certainly from bugs and hybrid food sources.
Right. Well, we can also look at this in another way too, right? So there's the energy outputs from these animals, right? But there's also the energy input that you have to put in, right, to raise the animal, to slaughter the animal, if you're going to eat it directly, or instead of eating what it produces.
Which this is a huge part. I really want you guys to hear what he's saying here with what it takes to keep this system in motion. Sorry. Go ahead.
Now, agriculture, and we're talking, pre-industrial agriculture takes a lot more work to get, in one sense, less calories put in out. Now, the one of the things that did allow for the rise of cities, of course, was large scale agriculture, but a lot of that was due to servitude, like in Egypt or Babylon. These were not necessarily free people. In Europe, they were, but that was small scale farming and in niche places, right? But if you're gonna, I haven't done the calculations, but if I would imagine, if you look at energy inputs in for energy inputs out, so for the same amount of calories you could get from a potato or potato crop versus the amount of calories you get out from a single cow and milk, I think the cow is going to be a much better deal for the energy you put in for the energy you get out. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't raise or eat potatoes, but I'm just saying if we use this meta-economic analysis of energy, animals should be the core of food production. That's what I'm saying.
Sorry, that was dead air. I was jumping on Google to see if I could actually, because I believe I've seen those, at least some form of study like you're talking about calorie expenditure versus calories produced.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm going from memory here, but it is livestock over vegetables almost every time.
Almost every time. And
Right.
we can see this in history with the ratchet effect of the steppe versus sedentary societies. They don't farm. Scythians don't farm, Huns don't farm, Mongols don't farm.
Yeah.
And they do one of two things. They either raise animals or they hunt. Right? So almost all their calories come in from consuming animals, either the flesh directly or their milk, right?
Yep.
Now, China, India, the Middle East, and Russia, most of what they ate came from vegetables. I think Russia probably had a higher percentage of meat eating than in China, India, or the Middle East. But they
Well,
just got curbed.
certainly in Siberia and stuff, but who wants to?
Well, I mean, like the original Russian city states. But
Okay, yeah,
the thing is that they all got curb stomped by the Mongols
yep.
because this is a population that has been eating animal products for thousands of years, and they're surrounded by people that just eat, agricultural products. And now the nobility and the aristocracy would eat, this kind of higher quality food. Problem is, there weren't enough of them to fight the Mongols, right? Because
Right.
they were a tiny minority ruling over. This is actually an insight from Broad Nationalist. He pointed out that these ruling classes of tiny aristocracies ruled over these large empires in India, China, and the Middle East because they just keep their population weak by feeding them cereals. Europe was different because it was like in between. The steppe didn't really eat much cereals, but Europe ate cereals and meat, and it was
Right.
widely distributed in its production in a way that was not the case in India, China, or the Middle East. And so, again, that's not to say you should not have agriculture. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is I don't necessarily think that should be the main source of food production within an energy efficient economy.
Todd, you want us all to become cowboys?
Well, it wouldn't be bad, would it?
Right. Well, and that goes into something that you were talking about right there with the Mongols is that their food source was mobile, the same way they were mobile. And so the energy to take their food with them, not only was it is easier to ride a horse or to tie a horse to your saddle and pull a horse than it is to carry 60 pounds of grain. That is so that energy cost continues to be an issue there. And being mobile allows you to go and conquer. Now, there's things that we can get into in that, yes, the Mongols conquered and then they kind of disappeared. Right. And so this going out and conquering doesn't necessarily translate to sustainment. And that's where we start getting into the actual application of industrial agriculture, not industrial agriculture as we understand it today, but as in that basic form of what does agricultural industry mean for a sustainable economy and for a sustainable people.
Well, right. And the other thing too, as you mentioned, it's more energy expensive to carry the grain. The human who then does all the work to produce the food has to then consume energy to power up again.
Yes.
And again, milk and meat are more energy dense. I mean, one of the things is the Scandinavians, when they went on their Viking raids, what did they mostly eat? Meat.
Fish.
They fish all around
Yep.
Scandinavia, and then cattle. Right? When you read the sagas, they take cattle to Vinland, right? Iceland. So they have very small scale agriculture, but it's hard because it's so far north, right? Further down, right? England, France, Italy, Spain, they still have a lot of agriculture mixed in there, right? And so they don't put up a very good fight against the Norse. Only really the Eastern Roman Empire does, and that because it's a centralized bureaucratic state. But just looking at energy, right? before you look at all the other stuff, this is just the most efficient way to do things, right? It's energy in, energy out. And um, there are, of course, other reasons why you might want to consume vegetables, for mineral content and certainly potatoes are a staple. You can live off those, right? The Irish did that. Many American settlers did that. But that's a step down, I think, from meat and animal products.
Yeah. Well, the easiest thing about certain types of vegetables is that they store better than meat. You could store meat. Now, see, this gets to you could store meat for a very long time if you have enough salt. But if you don't have access to that salt, then there are vegetables that are going to store for much longer than meat.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so,
and that's the trade-off. That's the
right.
trade-off, right?
Yep.
Because you could have the root cellar. So normally in like colonial or settler times, you would butcher the animals ritually at some point during the year because you couldn't maybe winter all of them, right? And then you just have that feast. But then during the winter, you'd have all the vegetables in the root cellar, and then whatever you could salt, right? But anything more than you could salt, you just had to eat when it was ready.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think ultimately what people need to do is, I haven't seen this. If you because it was the benefit here is because we're living in it's a literate society now where people actually write this down.
Yeah.
You might be able to read like ancient husbandry techniques from the Greeks and Romans, and while that might be useful to some degree, it's so far removed from our own current situation. But you could definitely read the accounts of settlers on the frontier in the 19th century and the early 20th century farmers before technology completely reorients the production of livestock and
Keep
agriculture.
keep talking for a second because I'm going to look something up. So if I'm
So the idea being then that they were also not only trying to have a sustainable agricultural system, but also make a profit as well. So they're not just in it just for that. How would they do it, right? Because if you want to ask people how do you breed, so I don't know, without modern technology, without all these modern stimulants, how do you breed animals the old-fashioned way over time? We've forgotten that, but it has been written down. I don't know who. I mean, I haven't done a study, but I'm sure there were American farmers, livestock raisers who would write down the optimal way to do these things. And so the first step would be to figure out who some of these authors are, and then take a look at what they're writing about. Because the other thing too, prior to the post-war economic boom in the United States, the resources that the bioregions determined what could be grown and what could be pastured in those areas in North America. So, out of necessity, anybody who wants to be, sensitive to their bioregion, those 19th century farmers would have to be as a matter of course, because except in a few cases out west, like I said, the aqueducts, you're not going to really have a lot of that infusion of energy from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of what he's talking about in here, and you can get accounts from settlers. The easiest jumping in place, well, excuse me, the easiest jumping in place is go to Tractor Supply, maybe Barnes and Nobles. You might find something, but certainly at a Tractor Supply, a Rural King, a Southern States. No, I'm sorry, Southern States won't have it. But anyway, what's another one? There's a third one, and I can't remember. But go to one of the big chain farm stores, and you're going to find books on how to build chicken coops and how to plant this and how to plant that. If you really want to start getting into the weeds, a fun one is the Foxfire book series. If you can find those on eBay, they might be reprinting them. I know some of them have gone in and out of print. It's just a lot of stories from Appalachia and from Virginia and different areas here in the States. It's got stories, everything from cryptids to, hey, we were raising some sheep. We don't know what sort of sheep they were, but they topped out at like 60 pounds. And here's what we were doing back then. Gets into butchering and just fun stuff that puts you in the mindset of what these people were doing. And everything Todd has been talking about tonight was something that people were participating in without thinking, because they knew that winter was coming, or they knew that this was the breeding season. they knew that they only had so much time to give to an issue. They only had so much energy to give to an issue. And so one of the things that we lost track of in the 20th century was that for their environment and for what they were trying to achieve, the generations prior to the interwar period had produced some really daggum good breeds of animals that were thrifty and hardy, that weren't going to suffer from different sicknesses. They had vegetables that could grow in a hard area and didn't have the extensive water requirements and energy requirements that a lot of the produce and livestock have nowadays. So now we've gone through this 150 years worth of excess, and we were able to funnel that excess into artificial gains. And so now it's a question of how do we get back into something that's sustainable. Now I will say the rough spot in there is I started out on my farm, which it's a whole bunch of niche products. I have a love hate relationship with what we're doing to keep this business solvent. Um, but the big issue with the hardiness and the energy requirements of the old breeds and the old stock is time. It takes 2 years for this hardy sheep to get up to 80 pounds, whereas I can use the improved breed and throw a little grain at it, and within 8 months I have that same 80-pound carcass. So that is an issue. And from a business perspective, you need to figure out how you want to sustain your business. But on this stream tonight, we're talking about what is a way forward for agriculture. What's a way forward on energy expenditures? What is a way forward in hierarchy? What is a way forward in government infrastructure and government management?
The other thing too is going back to my point earlier of the meta economic. It also requires a change of mind because we have a contractual mindset here where if I don't pay you a wage or a salary or some dividend of some kind, you're not going to do the work for me. That's not how agriculture works. Agriculture doesn't work like that historically. It is a communal necessary effort. Right? It's something that people
Yeah.
have to do. And in the case of the original agricultural centers in the Middle East, it was through active coercion. They forced you to do the work. But in Europe, where it wasn't necessarily active coercion, you still had these communal obligations whereby, some people, were the blacksmiths, some guys were the blacksmiths, some guys were the shepherds, some guys were the farmer, and they just had to do it, right? I mean, people had to eat, right? You didn't get to play these games. And that's going to be a problem because in the United States, you're not going to easily generate that mindset. Not now.
Okay. Yeah. So what do you see the future if you could play king for a day or just king's advisor? You know what what would you do in the next 20 years, and then what would be the end goal over the next 100 years that you would like to see?
Well, I mean, one of the first problems is we don't have a population resilient or strong enough to actually engage in raising animals or agriculture. Not anymore. It
Okay.
doesn't. It doesn't exist. The quickest, most efficient way to do this would be to have a government-wide program that does three things. Right. It has a nationwide physical fitness program where basically you sign up and then you get fed all the nutrients you need to grow strong and build endurance, and then train those people like say you would in the military, but they're not being trained to go to war, right? They're being trained to be able to do these kinds of things. So then you could have a second New Deal where then you build out the infrastructure necessary for this new kind of agriculture and new kind of pastoralism. Because again, you mentioned what the price costs, individuals don't have that kind of money.
Right.
that would be the most direct. Within 20 years, you could do that, I think. But was there a political will for it? No.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Okay. Now, what about within parallel economies? Is this a good expender of energy to consider agricultural issues and to try and start building some form of parallel agriculture?
Well, I think that's going to have to happen regardless, sooner or later, given the course that we're on, right?
Okay.
Um, the problem is I don't see how it's going to be done on an individual level. I think because of the examples that I pointed out previously, the Mormons in Utah and the kibbutz in Palestine, well, we're going to see you're going to need some sort of religious or ideological movement that can organize people in this way to do that. Because again, if we're not talking about the government, where is the money going to come from? Where is the support going to come from? Something like that. And the in order to build that sort of collective mindset, that community mindset of working together for a common goal, you'd have to have something like that. And that also can't just be stimulated magically. It has to occur through some sort of charismatic process. Which, so yes, that would be ideal, and hopefully something like that will happen. But I don't see people seeing the need for that, because you need something between above the individual but below the state, right? And that would be some sort of community oriented group, not just a community, but a strong, motivated one, like the early Mormons or the kibbutz. And in order to address that problem, the place you start is not necessarily buying land and livestock, but figuring out how to get other people to think like this.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, it puts into perspective. It would be well. I'm what it is that I'm wondering is I'm wondering if anybody has written much on is it Orania, the
Yeah, Arania.
yeah, Orania in South Africa. I would be curious to know. I know there's some voices on the internet and on X, kind of taking pop shots that's coming out wrong, uh, but they're on more micro issues. I'm curious what sort of their guiding directives and theory has been in producing their food and obtaining food.
Yeah, I don't know. That
Yeah,
will be an interesting question to figure out how to do that. But I guess if you want to move beyond the energy level, the meta economic, I think we can say that given where we're at now, the profit motive is not actually good. See, there was a meme that I saw once where it was like had a fat man, a starving man, and a bodybuilder, and the starving man said socialist agriculture, and then the fat man was capitalist agriculture, and then the bodybuilder was fascist agriculture. So,
yeah,
but the point is, the market will poison you. That's
okay,
literally what it does with the food, because it wants to keep cutting costs. That's why everybody's sick and everybody has SSRIs and everything, because they deliberately poisoned us. Now, by just cutting the cost, they wanted to cut the cost and put in, they wanted to cut. So cutting was something that was done in World War One and World War Two in order to have ersatz food, so you could send real food to men on the front because they needed the calories. That's just now a matter of course. We really have to fundamentally rethink how food is produced, because this is the end result of the market deciding what food gets produced. It produces poison because poison is, I guess, is just cheaper to make. Um, and so if we get rid of that, well, then what do we have? Well, we certainly had communal production of food in the past, which maybe calling it socialism is anachronistic, but it's certainly not free market.
yeah, yeah. It is interesting. Um, in my case, again, doing niche markets, it's pasture raised meats and value added products and a lot of produce, and it's cool, it's nice, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to do it. Having said that, uh, it's not what I'm offering is not accessible to 85% of the people, because for me to be able to sustain this business, I have to sell it at, or I have to sell the products involved at a significant markup from what's going on down at Walmart. And so that it's frustrating in a way. Now, one of the things that you could do, just a rabbit trail for a minute, you can, if you want to set up something like this, you can jump into EBT and federal programs, so that people who have access to those funds are able to apply them within your store. But that's unfortunately a very small segment of people that will come and shop at something like this. And so there is it's kind of vicious and it's kind of nasty that not everyone has the ability to participate in what I'm doing here as an end product.
Yeah, and that's probably because you're not living in a community, right? If you were, then those people could consume what you
Right?
produce. Yeah,
Yeah. And that is an interesting thing. And how do we get? And you talked about it a couple minutes ago. In that, in general, it's awful to say, but we don't have a populace that can dig in, put their heads down, and say, this is what I'm farming, and this is what I'm producing, and this is what I'm willing to do labor wise to produce all of this. And so that is an issue, but I don't want to go so far as to say, let me figure out how to put this, because it's easy when people to hear this to say that Todd and I are making the argument for immigrant labor, for a living slave class within the U.S. And that's not the argument, but it is an argument that our energy expenditures within this area have been so low that it has to be retrained and it has to be redeveloped.
yeah. Well, that's like I said when you asked me what would I do if I were king of America.
Yep.
Well, one, I would get every able-bodied person I could and start training them to be physically fit enough to do this.
Yeah.
We feed them all the nutrients they need, and then we build out the new infrastructure in a second New Deal. That would be the most efficient
Oh,
way to do it.
dig into that. Dig into, because you've talked about that before. Go off on another New
Well, right,
Deal.
because right. Think about it. The things we take for granted now, like the highway system, that was built by the government, and the railroads were built through private partnerships. So the thing is, the infrastructure that we need for certain things doesn't magically develop. It doesn't come out of the ether. It's built intentionally, either by the government or through a public-private partnership. And so part of the problem is the infrastructure we need doesn't exist anymore. It's been destroyed. Something needs to be built that will be a bridge across that. What that might be, that's open for debate, right? But something needs to be built, physically built, right, which isn't currently exist. And well, that's how you would do it. But then also there's also techniques of agriculture and livestock raising that have been lost. So this sort of like not army boot camp, but we call it like the food production boot camp.
Mm-hmm.
You would teach men and women how to do these things, how to, along with the other training, and then the value added back to the government, back to the society, would be building out this new infrastructure that would allow for this kind of intermediate production of agriculture again, which we don't have anymore. And that's a sketch, but that's what you'd want to see.
Yeah. Now, you correct me on the terminology. You have talked. Is it the post cash nexus? Is that what you've talked about?
Yeah, post cash nexus. Yeah.
Okay.
No. Okay. Are you thinking of the virtue nexus?
I'm not sure. I know you've talked about transcending uh, money to some degree.
Well, right.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So in this regard, just to recap for anybody that doesn't know, the cash nexus is a concept that comes from Thomas Carlyle. let's imagine we have four social relations, right? We've got the relation of parents to children, community members to the church, community members to the government, and community members to a business. Now, what is the normal, ideal mode of relation? Well, right, between parents and children, it's natural affection. Between the church and the community, it's, fit in the Christian context, agape, religious love, right? With the government, it's using Aristotle, right? Using his idea, it's this organic connection with the people, with the polis, which produces justice, right? And then the market is where you exchange cash. Now, that's everything in its lane, right? But then what Carlyle critiques is in the cash nexus, everything becomes a simulation, because ultimately everything becomes the market, where everything is just money is the connecting link between parents and children, between the church and the people, between the state and the people. And so in this case now, everything is really a market. They don't call themselves that, but that's what it is now, because cash is the main way to track and account for the exchange of goods and services between these communities. Now, what it would look like if you transcended the cash nexus, because what a libertarian or a conservative or a modern capitalist would say is, well, this is just an efficient way of allocating resources, who produces the things, who consumes the things, or we're tracking all these things with money, right? Now, in the past, while we certainly had economic exchange of that type, right? Thinking like the Silk Road, lots of goods and services were produced that were not exchanged that way. So, for example, you hear a lot of people on the right, well, why can't poor people have kids? Because, unlike in the Middle Ages, childcare you have to pay for. Nobody paid for childcare in the Middle Ages unless you were like a wealthy noble person. Childcare was produced by the community as a part of filial obligation. And so, yeah, of course, you could be poor and have kids. And then furthermore, provisioning and taking care of the children, a woman's body is designed specifically for that. But modern women are not trained to use their bodies in that way. So while they might have the tools latent in their own person, they don't know how to use them. So they lack knowledge, and they also lack this reinforcing mechanism, which has been destroyed over the last century, right? It's been wiped out. And so how do you what I would say is that we need to have a new nexus of exchange, and that would be virtue. So a good example of this, to reify the concept, would be the end of the Odyssey, where the swineherd and the cowherd support Ulysses in his retakeover of Ithaca from the suitors. And what does he do? He builds them palaces. He puts them right next to his palace. He gives them wives. No money is exchanged because they already proved their worth, not only in helping him reclaim his throne, but by 20 years of loyalty to Penelope. That doesn't happen anymore. And so why? Well, because virtue isn't valued anymore. Virtue, there's a common theme in old books called a man of good character. And you would want to promote a man of good character because, well, you wouldn't want him to steal from the cash register while no one's watching, because he has good character, right? So, but who are the people that get ahead? Well, not those people today, right? That's why you have the phrase nice guys finish last. Okay, well, this is just a really badly designed incentive structure where the people who cut corners, do the wrong thing, they're the ones that get the money. And once they get the money, they can then do all these other things, which in the past would have been frowned upon, right? And so how do you keep track? Well, first of all, for the production of any given good, right, the question then becomes, well, who should consume it? Who deserves it? Who needs it? Well, in the modern capitalist economy, whoever has enough money to buy it doesn't tell you anything about that person. Could be a good person, could be a bad person, right? But in any decent society, it should be those men and then their dependents who are the ones that uphold the principles and standards of that society, which is just not what we have in the United States anymore.
So how do we get there? That's an easy question.
Well, again, everything thought precedes action.
Okay.
So everything we're talking about, and everything the dissident right's been talking about for the last 15 years, has to first occur in the mind. There has to be a fundamental change in how people think. And I think part of the problem has been trying to identify where that trip up is. Where have people gone wrong in the way they think?
Okay. Do you? So we're deviating a little bit, but do you see? So let's say that the capitalist was the grifter, and say Dr. 1.0. It was the grifter. Most of whom have washed out to some degree or another. Easiest person to name would be somebody like Ethan Ralph. So you've got that. Do you see now where the man of good character is the one that more and more is being elevated and is having a louder mic?
No,
Okay. Okay.
no. I mean,
Is it still um, more or less purely cash nexus at the moment? You think
yeah.
within the
Oh
DR?
yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
It's still that. Now that's not necessarily to say that these people are transparent grifters like Ralph, but they're not fundamentally motivated by. Oh, this can be easily seen with the tradcons and the circular firing squad with the incel anons, right?
Okay.
It's like, well, okay, you got your six figures. You okay? Well, it's no surprise to anyone that you're getting laid now. Give me a break. Like, how do you get those guys six figures? Well, they don't have any advice. They just constantly posture, and it's like, well,
Okay.
hold up. How is that helping the rest of the community, right? How is the rest of the community benefiting from this? See, what we don't see, right? And this is what you'd have to see to prove that we've shifted from the cash nexus to the virtue nexus. Is now granted not everybody that complains on X from the Anon right are the swineherd, so to speak, from the Odyssey, but some are. Figure out who those guys are, and just have a crowd fund where they get their house, where they get their business. Just do it, because that's the right thing to do based on solidarity, virtue, looking out for your fellow white man. That's not happening, and I have a hard time seeing that happen in the immediate future.
Yeah. There, there's a part of me. There is a part of me that says, well, when it all washes out, it's always going to be 10 families that unite and go and do something big, create their new Utah, their new Mormon land, and that's what it's going to take. The other interesting part of that, though, is outside of the Mormons, the 80s and the 90s were certainly a bitter pill to watch. The government was aware of this stuff, and if you strayed too far out the zone, they were ready to step on you, to the point that I think there is some generational issues now. Um, a lot was lost in those days. I mean, you can't just sit back and look at the old Randy Weaver and Ruby Ridge and all that and be like, he didn't lose anything. No, he lost a lot. And so
Mhm.
it's going to be interesting, I think, over the next, let's say, 20 to 30 years to see how these communities start forming. And I'm curious to see if it's going to take a relative collapse, if it's going to be, I really do respect the guys that are focused on lawfare and focused on getting into elite circles. I don't want to be doomer, but I have some questions on the viability of that, even though I respect the idea. So it's going to be interesting.
Well, I mean, I think Machiavelli shows us with the prince that it's not really a viable strategy to come to the prince and say, "Hey, I can tell you how to govern your country better." Didn't work for
Yeah,
Machiavelli.
fair enough. But yeah, so this is good. I think on agriculture agriculture is going to be an issue. It's going to be an issue due to immigration. It's going to be an issue due to the current cash nexus that the entire country is in, that the entire global economy is in currently. It's going to be an issue because it's involved in a global economy and there are imports into the US agricultural market. And so how you transcend these issues and how you operate at this point, unfortunately, to some degree, within the cash nexus, and make sure that you have a viable agricultural business is going to be very difficult and relatively unique to each business. Um, but yeah, I don't know that we solved too much, but we certainly brought light to a lot of the foundational issues that are going on, whether it's energy usage or the application of power. So,
Well, yeah, the ultimate problem is this is still conceptual. The
yep,
problem we're dealing with is still conceptual. We don't, because like you said earlier, people were unthinkingly conditioned to behave this way around animals, around farmland. We're not. That has to be completely constructed all over again, unless
yes,
you just want to let the hard schoolmaster of reality teach you when it finally comes due, which I think we'd all like to avoid that.
yeah.
So yeah, it's still primarily intellectual. That's still the problem.
Well, so and actually that two quick questions. I appreciate your time tonight, and then we'll chill and get out of here. One question for you is I already forgot my second one. Anyway, energy. Do you see any sort of nuclear, any sort of panacea in the future that will eliminate energy issues, fossil fuels, so on, and we don't have to worry about, at the very least, ex- expendable energy outside of. I know you know what I'm saying, but I'm trying to make it clear for those that are listening. So the actual energy sources that are external to us, do you see that being solved in any way?
Well, I guess you didn't see my video where I said nukes aren't real.
Well, I did see it, but I don't know who else has.
I know.
Right, right.
So, okay. Well, first of all, the EROI for nuclear isn't really that much better than other resources. And then, furthermore, there's going to be a bottleneck, right? Because you got to get the uranium out of the ground, right? That's the bottleneck. And you're not going to power an 80-ton earth mover truck with an electric battery. You need chemicals for that. You need petrochemicals, right? So we're still floating on the sea of petrochemicals, where you have to then put that into those trucks to then dig up the uranium and then process it, right? So ultimately, what you'd have to do, and this is where socialism comes in, the government would just have to say, "No gas for you, Mister Truck Boy. We're saving it for our earth movers so that we can get the uranium out of the ground." And I guarantee you, the right would have a civil war over that. So I don't think nuclear is going to be the answer. And then the other thing you have to do is you have to change the infrastructure. The transportation ecosystem would have to become rail, because you could power that through electricity, which nuclear power plants can generate. Again, the American right would have a conniption: no more cars. Like I don't know what these like right wing tech bro boys say. Oh, we want nuclear, so you want no cars and trucks? Is that it? No, I didn't say that. Well, that's the necessary entailment here. You're gonna have to ration what petrochemicals are left in order to keep, the resource extraction machines going, and then convert to trains, because that's the most. You can power that electrically. You could power cars and trucks as well, but that's not going to be as efficient as trains, and they're going to win out in the end under those conditions. But still, there's that bottleneck: getting it out of the ground. That's going to be petrochemicals. I don't see how you get around that.
All right. Perfect. All right. Well, hey, I know you're currently on sabbatical. You were gracious enough to show up tonight. Is there anything you want to shill? Anything you want to point people towards at this point?
Well, I mean, they can catch up on the backlog, right? So just
Mhm.
go to Praise of Folly podcast, right? I have my casual stream and my roundtables. That's mostly what I'm working on right now. But this is something people might be interested in. At the end of July, I'm going to have on Averill, Aarvoll, and Masonius Rufus to talk about building communities. So that's kind of related to tonight's show.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a shout out from Middleton Whitaker. Said, "Can't believe I almost missed this, and that I can't stay long even now." Well, shucks. Well, we appreciate you showing up, bud. And yeah, certainly well worth going back, checking this one out. Uh, like Todd just said a few minutes ago, the unfortunate reality is right now, so much of this is conceptual. It's conceptual because of the inability to apply it, and it's also conceptual because, frankly, the external pressures at this point are not extreme enough for most people to care.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Well, I appreciate it. What else do I have going on? I mean, if you guys are super interested in this agriculture stuff, there is a nasty, just a doomer documentary called Greener. Now that I'm, what was it, Greener Spaces? I can't remember. I went and reviewed it a couple weeks ago. That's worth checking into. And then recently had a little bit of back and forth with John Slaughter on X over where the American Shire is. Todd, what do you say? Where's the American Shire?
Probably Amish country, right?
Well, I said the Midwest. I said for better or for worse, that's sort of closed off, focused on what we're doing. We've got our farms. We don't care about the outside world. I said that was the Midwest. I compared the South to Gondor, and then I said Rohan doesn't exist yet.
You're working on it.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to go live with that one or not, but yeah, maybe I will at some point. But
All right.
yeah, I think that one is in flux and will be until external pressures continue to come on. Yep, greener pastures. Middleton hears it. All right, gentlemen, I appreciate it. Mr. Lewis, always a pleasure.
Thank
You guys
you.
have a good evening.